the hush that belongs to late evening, when a lamp draws a small golden circle and the rest of the room begins to drift into shadow, there is a kind of listening that only stories of the unseen can summon. Tonight, in that listening, we open the oldest of thresholds, the story of the god beneath the earth, Hades, Aidoneus, Plouton, a name that changes its garments but never its posture, a sovereign who rules not by thunder, not by spectacle, but by proportion, by the steady discipline of keeping what must be kept and returning what has ripened to the world above. You may think you already know him, the dark figure at the edge of Greek myth, the silent brother to Zeus and Poseidon, the one whose very name people avoided in polite conversation. Yet beneath the myths, beneath the fear and marble, lies a truth that feels strangely human, the story of a keeper rather than a conqueror, a craftsman of balance who teaches that endings are not confiscations but continuations. We will move slowly through his corridors because haste has never been welcome in his house. You will hear of a realm that is not a pit of fire but a library of kept things, a system of order older than law itself. You will meet the quiet colleagues who share his rhythm, Hermes, the messenger who guides souls by a torch's courtesy, the Furies, stern seamstresses of proportion, who repair the fabric of justice, Hypnos, who reminds kings and beggars alike of the democracy of sleep. And in the centre of these measured rooms you'll find not a monster, but a presence as calm as iron, as patient as earth, Aidoneus, the unseen, who governs what lies below with an ethics that the living world is still learning to imitate. To some, he is a symbol of death. But when you listen closely, death in his kingdom is not an eviction from life. It is life continuing by another method. Seeds go underground to rest before they bloom again. Metals sleep until summoned by fire. Names are stored like heirlooms until they can be spoken properly. The Greeks called this realm the Underworld, but it might better be described as the foundation, the deep room that lets everything above stay standing. Without him, no harvest could return, no oath could hold, no promise could mean anything at all. In this series, we'll walk the slow road from myth to philosophy, from the field where a young girl once picked a flower that opened like a door, to the quiet courts where judges weigh the weight of souls, to the modern cities where his manners survive in our laws, our rituals, our grief, and even our architecture. We will ask gently, what does it mean that a civilization made the god of endings also the god of wealth? What kind of wisdom hides in a name that means the unseen one? Why did a people so enamored with light build their moral universe around the patience of darkness? You will learn of Hades as Aidoneus, the veiled one who teaches humility, as Plouton, the giver of abundance, whose horn feeds the world, and as the keeper of a marriage that reshaped the calendar itself. You will hear of Persephone, the queen whose footsteps created the seasons, and of Demeter, the mother whose grief taught mortals the beauty of return. You will see how their story, so often mistaken for tragedy, is in truth a treaty between worlds, half the year for the fields, half for the roots, half for sunlight, half for rest. It is the oldest wisdom of balance, whispered in the language of pomegranate seeds. Through the eyes of poets, philosophers, and artisans, we'll explore how this god of the deep came to symbolize far more than death. In the black figure pottery of Athens, he is a steward with keys. In the Homeric hymns, a brother who takes no pleasure in conquest. In the sanctuaries of Eleusis, a silent partner in the mystery that promised comfort after grief. Later, as Rome learned to translate the Greek imagination into marble and decree, he became Pluto, lord not of despair, but of prosperity that renews. Every empire has a way of renaming what it cannot destroy, yet through every translation, one gesture remains unchanged, the open palm that accepts, holds, and eventually returns. As we travel deeper into his story, we'll step past superstition and into the quiet philosophy that pulses beneath it. We'll see how the ancient world used myth not to frighten but to teach, how the tale of Hades and Persephone offered a vocabulary for grief, a rhythm for mourning, and a ritual for courage. We'll touch the 5 rivers that still run through human emotion, sorrow that must be acknowledged, memory that must be honoured, passion that must be tamed, forgetfulness that must be forgiven, and the unbreakable promise that binds it all together. You will hear how Orpheus, with his doomed melody, discovered that faith is a forward act, how Heracles, in his brute wisdom, learned to borrow without stealing, and how ordinary families with crumbs of bread and cups of oil turned cosmic law into kitchen manners that lasted thousands of years. And if you listen with the right kind of patience, you might recognize the underworld in places you know. In a hospital where a nurse closes a curtain softly, in a courtroom where a judge lets silence cool a sentence, in the simple act of setting a key on a dish so it will not chatter through the night. There he is, still teaching through habit, still keeping the unseen parts of our lives in order. This is the story of Hades, Aidoneus, Plouton, the steward of endings, the custodian of return, the god of kept promises. It is the story of how a civilization dared to look into the dark and found there not terror, but structure, compassion, and the slow arithmetic of justice. It's about how myth, when understood deeply, becomes an instruction manual for being human, how every door we close, every farewell we speak, and every dawn we trust to come back is part of his quiet governance. So as the night settles and your room begins to learn the hush of listening, stay with me. Let the torches of this old house guide you gently. You'll find that the darkness here is not emptiness, it's depth. It's the kind of silence that holds rather than hides. And when the story ends, it won't really end at all. It will simply rest, like a seed beneath the soil, waiting for morning. Tonight, you are not just hearing about Hades, you are being invited into his rhythm, into a slower, kinder understanding of time, into a world where loss is part of the harvest, where grief is a language, and where even the unseen keeps its promise. And perhaps by the end, you'll find yourself breathing differently, slower, steadier, as if the earth itself had placed a hand on your shoulder and whispered, "I keep what you love safe. Go on. I'll see you again when it's time." In the hush, where lamplight teaches voices to lower, he is not yet a crown, not yet a rumour hardened into fear. He is simply a presence, like dark soil remembering rain, quiet, generative, unashamed of depth. Later, poets will hang names along his corridor. Hades the unseen, Aidoneus, the veiled lord, Plouton, the giver of wealth, each a lantern that lets listeners advance by small degrees. The oldest strands do not shout. They keep themselves in the grain of rites, in a half-line of hymn, in a few hard luminous words that disclose more by what they withhold. Aides, not seen. Aidoneus, master of what requires no display. Plouton, abundance, but not the courtly glitter of jewels. The slow arithmetic of earth, where grain wakes under frost, metals sleep until summoned, and every root counts patiently toward a harvest. Even before the genealogies arrive, as they always do once a people learns to map its ore, this philosophy is audible. What is beneath sustains what is above, and the truest governors work without spectacle. In one telling, he is son of Kronos and Rhea, brother of Zeus and Poseidon, a partner in the apportioning of the world, the sky to thunder, the sea to motion, the underworld to a knowing silence. Yet even here the story chooses velvet over brass. No battle cry gathers to him, no fanfare. His signature is learned at a threshold, in that moment when a person steps from light into shade and feels meaning, change, temperature. The old singers tended those temperatures like careful gardeners. In Homer, he is chill and remote, a god whose doors are firm and not easily moved by speech. In Hesiod, he is simply one brother among three, holding his portion without complaint. Across the centuries, as Greece bends its ear to furrow and coin and ore, another face turns toward the fire. Where Hades withheld, Plouton begins to bloom. Wealth becomes not hoard, but fertility, not treasure, but return. The mystery by which disappearance yields plenty. Burial itself looks like a hard, tender agriculture, bodies sown as a difficult crop, memory watered by tears, a harvest of names gathered in the living hand. No wonder certain sanctuaries whisper of him in Demeter's generous weather. No wonder Eleusis lets the torch do the teaching the mouth forbears. In such precincts, dread and gratitude blur, and the god below the lintel is addressed as winter is addressed, necessary, instructive, not to be hurried. He also teaches how to see by not staring. He is the truth that slips when confronted head-on, like stars that vanish under a direct gaze and flare at the edge of vision. So people approach him by companions and emblems, a key and a scepter, a helm that keeps its bearer uncounted by eyes, a quiet charioteer who never forgets the turn for home. For Hermes Psychopompos brings a soul to his door. Persephone's footfall becomes the hinge learning grace. The Arañas stand not as villains but as severe tutors of proportion. At the hearth, courtesy takes the shape of modest customs, a coin laid not as bribe but as provision, seasonal libations, the dead named without haste, as if speech itself might bruise. Scholars still weigh the older stones. Some see pre-Hellenic fields where the earth's generative powers wore many faces, and a god of below already walked the furrows. Others point to Bronze Age silences and ask whether the unseen had yet cohered. Under the right moon, the arguments stay calm. What matters to a listening heart is the contour that does not change. He governs what is kept, oaths, promises, sleep, and his realm is not exile from the world, but the world's deep room, where accounts are totalled without malice. Even his severity sounds like a workshop in which every tool goes back exactly where it belongs. He does not punish whims, he refuses disorder. The helm of invisibility is less a trick than a rule of conduct. The right to move without forcing notice, the ethic of leaving surfaces untroubled while tending their roots. If thunder is the god's hand writing in the open, his work is the margin's pencil, necessities, directions, small arrows showing where sense continues. Yet a tenderness threads his titles. Plouton implies a hand that brings forth wheat from dark, ore from stone, understanding from grief. On funeral vases, guiding figures lean toward travellers with professional affection, like midwives practicing an inverted birth. At house altars, families keep a small grammar of gratitude, bread, oil, a name said properly, and stitch waking rooms to the kept world without drama. Small wonder, later ages, tired of fear, preferred his wealth-bearing name. With Roman ears, Pluto and Dispata acquire marble polish, but the older logic breathes beneath whenever a furrow turns after winter and the air smells of earth and recollection, whenever a story ends, and the quiet that follows feels not empty but kept. Beneath the floorboards a patient order holds. Beneath the names, a labour without spectacle sustains the day. There the lesson of origins reveals itself, not a single point, but a slow unfurling. A god recognised less by arrival's flash than by the changed behaviour of a room once he has entered it. And so the listening continues, a coin resting where lamplight can think, a key learning the shape of a lock it will one day meet, a road lowering its voice toward the place where thresholds practice their craft. Soon there will be tales of brothers casting lots, of a crown that prefers iron to gold, of a chariot whose wheels know every turn in the earth. For now, the door has only breathed. Somewhere a sparrow tests the sill, somewhere the grain considers its climb, and somewhere, below the speech of soil, a name is gathering itself, not to frighten, but to keep. The room holds its breath while the story learns its weight, and the figure whose name has smouldered, like coal light beneath the floor, begins to take on the edges of a life, less a coronation than a temperament formed by what must be kept. After the first measuring of the world, when thunder had not yet learned its dramatic handwriting, 3 brothers are remembered as standing in a hush like uncarved stone. Lots were cast, or perhaps that gesture was invented later, so a simple motion could carry the burden of partition. Sky, sea, and the deep room below were assigned not as rival fiefs, but as crafts, each with its native patience. The eldest artisan of boundaries accepted the task that admits no boasting, to tend the chamber where endings become resources, where remembrance ferments into meaning. It feels like a master choosing the sturdy bench over the bright balcony. He is imagined with a sceptre, not brandished but rested, the way a keeper of keys lets his hand hover near the ring without ever making it jangle. His truth grows by negative space. He does not storm, nor plead, nor bargain. He keeps. Keeping asks for quiet strength. The poets who pace his hallway add their details sparingly. A helm that allows one to pass through attention without bruising it, the tool of someone who prefers the work to the announcement. A chariot that is not a parade, but a conveyance for those who must travel inward, wheels turning like patient thoughts. A court that is less court than well-run archive, where oaths are whole numbers and debts are tallied without heat. He is made by what passes through him. Kings with braided stories and carpenters with clean hands, children whose names are acorns small, and elders whose names have widened to the weathered breadth of doors. Each arrival leaves a lesson, and by learning to receive without wavering, he becomes the one who cannot be flattered and therefore cannot be defrauded. His house is iron-gated, they say, and so it is. But iron well tended does not merely bar, it remembers its proper shape. Keys speak to such metal, with a music of teeth and channels, so his early image includes the grammar of locks. What opens must be earned, what closes must be trusted, and what is set in order can be approached without fear. Around him, colleagues take their places with practiced calm. Hermes keeps the escort's path fluent in the dialect of thresholds. The Furies stand like the conscience's elder aunts, severe but not without love. Thanatos, more hush than person, attends the instant when a candle's lesson becomes smoke. In time, a queen will come by a road of flowers and necessity, and the house will learn spring's accent. But before that, foundations cure like mortar, slowly, with a goodness that does not require applause. Old hymns preserve the scaffolds, a brother among brothers, the steward of a place that is appointment, not exile, a sovereign whose wealth is measured not in coin alone, but in the reliability of return. Farmers know him before courtiers do. What is a field, if not a rehearsal of his logic? Seeds disappear and do not disappear. The surface pretends to emptiness, while the underside labours. In their mouths, His wealth-bearing name sounds right, not because he scatters treasure, but because he remains with what others cannot bear to keep. Under that name, his becoming softens, not a hoarder of night, but a custodian of circulation, like a river, completing itself as groundwater, like grief becoming bread when given time. Even the helm takes on an ethic, a discipline of invisibility in a world besotted with noise, a way of saying, let me move without stealing notice from those who need it more. Scholars, gardeners of uncertainty, disagree gently about the first stones. Was his title carried forward from an older soil logic long before thunder acquired its name? Did the Bronze Age speak of him by means of absence, because to speak too boldly would breach the courtesy owed to endings? The questions make a low wind in the leaves of the tale, reminding us that becoming is a braid, never a single cord. And so he takes shape in tree strands, civic, laws that close and open cleanly, domestic, rituals that teach children to name their dead without bruising the air, and pastoral, the conduct of fields in winter. Listen closely and you can hear how households rescued his reputation from terror. Families pour a little oil, set a small cake where a shadow can remember sweetness, speak names without hurry. These gestures train a town to hold the unseen without panic. In such homes he becomes his best self, not a glutton of shades, but the librarian of quiet continuities. In sanctuaries where torches proceed like careful teachers, his becoming is given ceremonial polish, a sovereign who never haggles with fate, yet makes room inside fate for tenderness, the hand on a shoulder, the pause at the gate. He came to be as deep rooms come to be, by the trust of those who enter and the integrity of those who tend. If you're keeping company with us now, somewhere between the day you've set down and the night that asks only your breath, tell us where in the world you are and what time your sky is showing. And if this slow companionship feels right, consider resting a small promise with us by subscribing to the entire history, so these torchlit corridors can find you again when evening puts on its blue. Ahead lies the first true turn in the road, a girl in a field, a flower that may be a door, and a season learning the art of leaving. Morning, in the old valley, tasted faintly of ash and apple, and in that softened light, the day that would alter the cadence of fields began with a girl kneeling to decipher the syntax of flowers. She did not pluck so much as listen with her hands, letting each stem sound its quiet note and each petal widen into a vowel in the language plants reserve for patient listeners. Her companions, soft-shod, the kind whose laughter does not trouble bees, moved nearby with baskets the colour of butter and clay, and the hillside, rested like a well-slept elder, received their passing without complaint. Far off the sea rehearsed its silver, while the brook closer by threaded a calm sentence through the reeds, and for a while it seemed a day appointed only for humbler excellences. Dough rising toward bread, a ribbon retied, sunlight forgiving new leaves with a slow hand. And yet in that clarity, a knot door began to think like a door. Later centuries would pin the instant to a narcissus pale star, mirror-minded bloom. But the old cadence insists the botany matters less than the behaviour, a beautiful thing that, when leaned toward, leans back with hinge strength. The earth, courteous, with thresholds, parted in orderly fashion, as if honouring the restraint he requires in others. A seam opened, not by violence, but by purpose, and a chariot rose, like a dark sentence placing its long-awaited period. No trumpet, no clamour, only wheels keeping their promise to turn, and a driver whose stillness declared a life's apprenticeship in silence. The girls scattered with cries more surprised than afraid, and the one at the hinge, whose name would become the calendar's pulse, lifted her face in that complicated astonishment reserved for meetings that feel both chosen and fated. Scholars, gardeners of careful descent, still debate the key of that moment: abduction or appointment, cruelty or covenant, sorrow's school or the earth's economies learning to speak. Some hear, in the hymn, a grief so deep that even spring tastes of ache. Others hear a steady accord of initiation, a rite by which surface remembers depth, and depth remembers to send surface back. The tale keeps both channels open like a river, with room to wander. What does not waver is the craft of descent. The chariot does not seize so much as claim, and the air takes on the discipline of a temple, where gestures matter. In one telling she drops a belt of flowers, in another the petalled ring remains tidy on the grass, like an invitation to return. He, disliking spectacle, lifts her not as capture, but as one lifts a vow, sure-armed, unhurried. The horses, dark and workmanlike, behave as if the route has been walked 1,000 times, and will be walked 1,000 more. And the earth, obedient to its hinge, closes with the mild sound of a book finding its shelf. Above, the hillside forgets almost nothing. A blade of grass bent the wrong way, a bee reconsidering its task, the hush where laughter used to be, while the companions run for the city with their baskets breathing. Already the story seals itself into soft household wax. Mothers count steps that do not return. Grandmothers light lamps before the sun has thought to set. When tidings reach the woman whose patience instructs the seasons, the world begins to practice withholding. Bread hesitates, seeds adopt a listening posture. Wells remember depth, but delay their speaking. It is not a tantrum, but a demonstration. The surface cannot pretend sufficiency without the visiting rhythm that goes below and comes faithfully home. In sanctuaries where torches are trained to walk slowly, this instant earns ceremonial polish, not a crime scene, a choreography. The daughter becomes both traveller and teacher, the mother both sorrow and governance, the quiet sovereign below, both keeper and partner in a treaty older than law. The hymn offers a queen who must learn 2 accents and a husband who must learn to share. It offers the taste of a seed eaten at the wrong or right time, another debate kept low-voiced, whose ruby arithmetic binds her to a calendar. 6 seeds, or fewer, or 1. The numbers vary with the village. The lesson holds. Depth must have its portion, and that portion must be honoured with the same courtesy as light. If you are listening now with the soft attention that evenings teach, perhaps lying where your window saves a small square of sky, tell me, where in the world are you, and what time is your sky keeping? And if this unhurried company feels like the right kind of hush, consider resting a small promise with us by subscribing to the entire history, so these torchlit corridors can find you again when evening puts on its blue. Below, the chariot road reveals itself not as a terror path, but as a school of pace. Doors opening when they must, closing when they should. The riders declining speech because a pact is being tended inside the silence. He knows a mother whose authority can teach rivers to refuse. She knows a house where her daughter will not be filed away, but seated beside a seat. Between them, a messenger will soon move, wearing light the way a key wears knowledge, and he will mediate with that patient, exacting courtesy that reminds a city how law is born from listening. Not yet, though, not yet. For now, the road learns their names by heart. The cavern's forks behave like thoughtful hosts, and the iron gate, well kept, never sulking with rust, makes the quiet sound a hymn makes when it chooses its next word. Up above, A mother tightens her cloak. Fields consider staying asleep. Ovens cool early, like promises saving breath for a longer sentence. Somewhere a torch is kindled with a respect that could teach any door its duty. Somewhere a brook pauses, as if remembering a deeper channel. And somewhere in the measured dark, a palace that does not boast readies a chair beside a chair, while far away a palm holds a small scatter of red seeds that cannot yet decide whether they are a mistake or a calendar. The palace that does not boast receives them like a well-run harbour at night, lanterns trimmed to sensible halos, thresholds washed, the air carrying that rare mineral cool you only find where stone has kept its promises for a very long time. Antechambers breathe measured distances. Corridors keep their angles, as if geometry itself were a species of courtesy. And the attendants, mostly functions given human patience, move with the competence of old instruments tuned before dawn. She enters not as quarry, but as a guest who has not yet chosen her room. And he, faithful to his craft, lets the house speak first. The floor offers a tempered echo. The doors rehearse their soft closings, and at last a quiet hall opens like a palm, where a table waits with bread, clean water, and fruit that remembers sun even underground. Above, meanwhile, the world acquires the tone of withheld breath. The mother's grief does not rage, it organises. Fields answer as faithful fields do when the season is wrong. They fold their green back into themselves, hold their grammar in reserve and wait. Wells grow reflective, flocks practice stillness. Bakers set dough aside and listen to silence rise instead. A city learns the difficult knowledge that love can negotiate with sky and calendar both, and rumour, that quick-footed citizen, moves gently from eve to eve. If the daughter does not return, the world will simply decide not to proceed. In that cool pressure, a messenger is sent. Hermes steps into the underworld the way a key steps into a lock, unargumentative, shaped for purpose, wearing attention like a travelling cloak. He has not come to scold or plead, he has come to calibrate. What follows has the timbre of a workshop, where everyone knows the measurements by touch. The sovereign below does not snarl, the messenger does not flatter. They set the matter on the table as a tool in want of oil. One mother's authority, one daughter's future, one world's winter. Some later tellers, fond of edges, name it ransom. The older music calls it treaty. And the girl? She listens with the discipline of someone who knows two languages are about to belong to her, the language of ripening and the language of return. In some versions, the fruit waits on a plate, like a small clock in red segments. In others, a seed is offered like a lesson. Shared with the kindness that understands learning will change you. 1 seed or 6, or something between. Hymns differ, and scholars in calm rooms tilt their heads in different directions. But every number speaks the same word. Portion, a share for depth, a share for light. For a long minute, the hall holds itself in listening. He watches without pressing. That is his form of love. She considers what kind of queen she means to be, and whether sovereignty asks for one room or the art of walking between rooms without tearing her name. When at last fruit is touched, by accident, consent, or a nobler mixture, the calendar shivers into shape. Not a prison sentence, a vow with months in it. Above, a hinge moves in the air. At Eleusis, the torches lift, and the priests who tend them, archivists of thresholds, recognize the choreography that grief has taught them to expect. There will be descent and return. There will be a drought that is not punishment, but syllabus, and a spring whose green tastes faintly of gratitude. As terms gather, Hermes' voice becomes a plumb line by which both houses keep true. The daughter shall come home to upper fields and teach streets how to exhale again, and then, when the portion of seeds calls her name, she will go below to sit beside the waiting chair, no shadow, but partner, teaching quiet rooms to inflect their law with mercy. If you are with us now, lids heavy, while the lamp obeys the hour, tell me softly where in the world you are, and what time your sky is turning. And if this gentle walking between worlds comforts you, consider subscribing to the entire history, so these unhurried corridors know how to find you when evening puts on its blue. Down here, a crown is fetched that looks more like ironwork than jewellery, forged in the language of useful things. Attendants bring garments that remember both meadow and cavern, hems stitched with small motifs, grain heads, keys, rivers, like scholarship, worn as grace. She tries her seat, not to rule a population of shades, but to learn the rate at which consequence ages into kindness. Relieved to no longer keep alone, he shows her rooms. No tourist him remembers. The chamber where oaths are repaired, the porch where remorse is coached toward restitution, the registry where names are spelled slowly, so no syllable is mislaid. Her presence changes the air. Halls begin to smell of loam warming after frost, and somewhere a musician, felt more than seen, tests 3 notes as if asking whether the underworld owns a scale of its own. In time, ceremonies will mark her goings and comings. Festivals will teach cities to read the year as a breathing body. But tonight is rehearsal rather than pageant. Lamps are trimmed. The road to the gate is swept. The horses, practical as ever, stamp once and wait. Far above, a mother's cloak loosens by a finger's width, and fields, hearing something like permission, allow a few blades to consider green again. Nothing hurries. The treaty requires every participant to respect the craft of pacing, doors opening only when their hinges have learned the note. So the palace settles. The messenger withdraws with the tidiness of one who returns every tool to its peg, and the new queen of a deep and necessary country, who holds in her mouth the arithmetic of seeds, looks toward a future that will keep 2 winters and 2 springs within and without. Somewhere a small bell answers a distant passage like a drop of light meeting stone, and at the world's surface a bud that has been holding its breath lengthens by the width of an eyelash, as if remembering an appointment it intends to keep. Morning finds the treaty holding its note, and the house, having learned the cadence of her tread, prepares the first day of return without trumpet or glare, only the workmanship that follows a night of exact folding, lamps pinched closed by fingertips that honour their labour, doors opened with the hush of librarians turning a page, horses brushed until their coats carry a mild dusk, as if evening itself had agreed to escort her upward. At the gate she stands beside him, and for a breath they regard the iron the way students regard a wise teacher, firm, consistent, not unkind. Then his hand, with the old craftsman's affection, touches the bar as if to say, we keep what must be kept, so that what must move can move without fear. And the hinges, remembering Hermes' lesson, answer with a low vow while the road lifts from its rest. She does not rush into light, but steps toward it as a season steps into a field, considering, proportionate, letting every surface remember what depth has given it, while along the way the rooms of the underworld perform their new manners with a glad restraint. In the chamber of oaths, ledgers close without bitterness. On the porch of remorse, a man whose hands trembled 2 winters ago now steadies a bowl for a stranger. In the naming office, a clock pauses to savour a syllable that once snagged on grief but now passes smooth as river stone. He keeps pace at her side without leaning. That is his form of care. And the helm, that instrument of restraint, hangs unused because to be unseen now would be to refuse a rightful witness, and he has promised himself the discipline of watching. Where stone begins to think of soil, Hermes arrives with the punctuality of a well-kept clock, tipping the air back toward surface grammar. No speeches, just a nod, the shape of trust, and the path continues in a gradient of scent, mineral cool, warming to loam to old leaves to the rumour of grass not yet decided to be green. Above, the mother has not slept as mortals count sleep, but has kept vigil in the exacting posture of one who loves the world enough to teach it boundaries, and the fields have listened for her slightest permission. Wells have watched their own faces. Bakers have kept dough beneath cloth as if under a patient aunt's hand. When the hinge in the air loosens, men at ploughs and children at window edges feel it together. A dairy cow lifts her head with ceremonial surprise. An old woman trims a wick. She never let die. And the meeting that follows is not collision but knowledge. Two pairs of hands remembering how to greet without clutching. The mother's authority softening into welcome as the daughter's new gravity becomes a courtesy fit for any room. Around them, the city exhales. Ovens reclaim their heat. Seeds revise their privacy. Doors, having practiced stillness, practice traffic. And in the underworld a second spring begins, the keeper returning alone to walk the corridors that now hold her pattern, to check the tools, and note the places where mercy has left bright lacuna in punishment's old script, his solitude not curdling but ripening into the kind of stewardship that measures keeping by the willingness to share. The year receives its curriculum at Eleusis. Torches walk like careful teachers. Grain is handled with the formality of sacrament. Priestesses recite a choreography in which grief stands beside instruction and no one interrupts, while initiates are asked to carry in their bodies a map of descent and return, so that when private winters come, they will not mistake a door for an end. And though scholars will keep arguing in calm rooms about what exactly was shown or said, the villagers hold what matters. Bread rises again. Love may negotiate with time. A queen can divide her year without dividing herself. In the houses along the road, small rites echo the large ones. A child places a crumb on the threshold with equal parts solemnity and glee. A father sets a cup of water where a breeze might remember it. A grandmother counts her dead softly as buttons until each name lands without tearing the room. And these light gestures calibrate a culture's courage, telling the dark it may sit nearer without scaring the light, telling the light it must learn the grammar of returning. If you are listening now with the kind of attention evenings encourage, perhaps lying where a square of window keeps a piece of your sky, tell me, where in the world are you? And what time is your night learning to glow? And if this unhurried companionship brings you ease, you're warmly invited to subscribe to the entire history so these torchlit corridors and rooms of remembering can find you whenever blue gathers at the edges and you want a story to keep you company. The first weeks of her return read like a lesson plan written in blossoms as orchards test their voices. Frost bargains, then concedes. Riverbanks try on the soft edge of green, like a promise they intend to keep, and she walks the fields without apologizing for having learned two sovereignties, kneeling to feel the hum of work underfoot, and answering the ground's gratitude with a touch both intimate and official. While in marketplaces rumours of her poise travel faster than carts and mothers, tell daughters that a crown can be shaped like an appointment rather than a possession. Below, he reads the ledgers as if they were letters from a friend abroad, reports of fairness, the cadence of accounts reconciled, the tender corrections mercy makes to arithmetic without breaking it. And some nights he steps to the gate to lay his palm against the iron, not to open it, but to feel the faint warmth the world has left there, the warmth of her passing like a steady comet. So the year adopts its breathing, descent, return, keeping, spending. Night teaching day its manners, and day thanking night for its patience. No clamour, only the understanding that circulates like groundwater, unseen yet proven by every tree. And when the season thickens to the exact point where fruit leans back into the hand that raised it, someone in a quiet house notices a sign, a key left practicing on a saucer, a seed remembering its arithmetic on a windowsill, a shoe turned deliberately toward a road, the room holding its breath one heartbeat longer than usual, while in the lane outside a torch lifts, as if reminded by a courteous star. If a house is known by the company it keeps, then the deep and necessary country wears its fellowship like a well-made key ring, each companion a precise tooth that turns the lock without scraping. Beside him now stands a queen whose poise teaches corridors to breathe differently, his stewardship a still axis, hers a seasonal grammar that asks stone to remember meadow and meadow to honour the seriousness of stone, so together they keep a pace that denies calamity its swagger and forbids sorrow to pose as the final word. Around them move colleagues whose duties are older than rumour. Hermes, with the exact diction of thresholds, never early, never late, whose walking makes doors behave and persuades echoes to tidy themselves. Charon, gruff as any miller, exact in his measures, not from pettiness, but from the discipline that keeps weight and passage in accord, so the ferry will not swerve. The judges, Minos patient and grave, Rhadamanthys with the careful ear, Iarchus with the mason's honesty, seated where the acoustics favour truth, their benches polished by long listening, their justice a plumb line held steady until the wall admits its lean. The Furies, Alecto, Megaera, Persephone, stand like stern aunts of proportion, as old as the first injury, insisting that unstitched deeds be stitched, and that cuts be mended in the same fabric that was torn. They frighten because surgery frightens, never because they mistake cruelty for law. Thanatos moves like the last syllable of a lullaby. Hypnos, his gentler twin, keeps a room where pillows learn consent, and kings practice the democracy of sleep. Hecate holds her torches at the triple ways without flattery, honouring the girl who learned 2 accents, and in certain hours, walking at her side like a senior colleague, showing a new official the night shift. The older him remembers that she alone heard the hinge and closed her hand around the knowledge without breaking it, which is why her lanterns belong to both neighbourhoods. There are others a city seldom names, but every hearth would miss, clerks who shepherd syllables so no dead are misfiled, midwives of the reversed kind who receive last breaths with the same respect as first cries, gardeners coaxing asphodel into a meadow that remembers the long middle, lives neither notorious nor blank, the generous anonymities that truly hold a world. Elysium is no parade ground here, but a precinct where certain labours finally put down their tools because the task is complete. Tartarus, a word that tastes of iron, is kept far and locked, not as spectacle as quarantine for harms too volatile to sit near a kitchen, and he does not boast of it. Rumour is a poor cartographer, the map is drawn by function, and under his stewardship function becomes almost tender. He dislikes waste not from miserliness, but because every excess begins as a deficit elsewhere, or should not be torn if the plough needs that strength. A grudge should not be fed if a vow goes hungry in the next room. In such an economy, his wealth-bearing name shows its honest face. Plouton, called so by hands chapped and eyes relieved, because wealth is what returns. grain after winter, justice after injury, breath after a good cry. Scholars, those gardeners of uncertainty, bend over the household questions with gentle interest, whether Macaria is truly a daughter or a blessing spelled as a person, whether Zagreus is an older fish flashing under later waters, but nothing essential shakes. Across variance the craft holds, no spectacle, no bargaining, an aversion to both cruelty and neglect. Even the famous helm, where invisibility is not a trick but a moral, reminds the staff to work without begging attention. He wears it rarely now, having learned that presence, when rightly kept, does not make a room smaller. Walking his corridors, he notes the small mercies that have crept into procedure since she took her chair. A ladle of water left for the ferryman on hot days, a bench moved 2 feet toward the light for those awaiting their turn, a porch added where remorse can practice its new alphabet before stepping into judgment. And he does not call these reforms, only housekeeping. Above, in mortal rooms, the company is mirrored in miniature. Torchbearers at Eleusis, rehearsing the choreography of return. Mothers, teaching children to speak the dead without bruising the air. Old men, befriending Hypnos and discovering that good waking belongs to those who rest well. And through these houses run the signs of fellowship at work, keys hung where hands can find them in the dark. Bread set aside for visitors whose names cannot be written, seeds kept in a small cloth bag like a pocket calendar of faith. If there is a secret to the people behind him, it is that none are ornamental. Each stands where a necessary hinge turns. Each treats sorrow as something to be bolted to meaning rather than to melodrama. When failures happen, as they do in any jurisdiction that serves the untidy human, he does not rage. He recalibrates. Judges ask for a new testimony. Furies lower their voices and repeat the principle until it fits. Hermes redraws a line so traffic can flow without trampling. It is undazzling work, which is why it works. At the centre, with his queen beside him, he keeps the tempo that lets everyone else be excellent, slow enough for care, firm enough for trust. And perhaps that is why, on certain nights when the air above tastes faintly of coming frost, a composure not entirely one's own arrives to take the chair of the chest, like a borrowed steadiness, the fellowship's quiet outreach, the underworld's courtesy, deep rooms sharing surplus calm with houses that have forgotten how to breathe. As the company settles to its benches again, somewhere a small bell gives a single silver note, and a corridor lengthens by the width of a thought, while farther down, the rhythm of unhurried footsteps suggests the next simpler wonder, what an ordinary day looks like when no legend is watching. Morning in the deep country keeps time without sunrise, and the hours wear the dignity of old instruments. First comes the faint crackle of ledgers waking, pages that have learned how to hold grief without smudging. Then the corridors draw a cool breath from the stone, and the gates, which never sleep, lower their attention by a hair to acknowledge that duty has laced its boots. He is already walking, not striding. Spectacle is beneath his craft, but in that steady cadence that coaxes other feet into their best behaviour. He moves as a surveyor of trust might move, his hand near a sceptre that serves less as baton than as straight edge, a way to test plumb. The helm is carried, not worn, a reminder that invisibility is a discipline, not a trick. First he goes to the ferry where the river keeps its ancient appointments. He greets the boatman with the nod craftsmen reserve for one another, recognition without waste, and reads the tally not for coin alone, but for fairness of passage. A child without fare, faithfully remembered by a people, receives an index of kindness. An emperor whose lips glitter, but whose keeping has been poor, learns the democracy of water and waits. No speeches are required, the river explains. From there, he walks the meadow that remembers the long middle, the asphodel, where unadvertised goodness strolls with the unhurried calm of chores completed well. He does not hunt for heroes, he listens for friction, a name snagging on a thorn of regret, a bench that would be kinder 2 steps toward the path. He gestures, attendants shift a stone, a conversation that needed a porch finds one, a shade sits easier. In Elysium he will not linger, completion needs little oversight. He simply attends, a teacher's laugh still travelling like a small ferry, a mason's shoulders relaxing as if the stone he carried has finally chosen its own shelf. He leaves them to their economy of contentment and proceeds to the house of tall listening where the 3 judges polish their benches by use. Morning there is a jurisprudence of patience. He reviews a case not to bend it, but to make sure its weight has been read correctly. An oath broken under duress is not an oath broken for vanity. The difference is the temperature of a soul, and his hand knows temperatures as a blacksmith's hand knows iron. When the Furies speak, voices like cords kept oiled, he lets their severity stand until it reveals the stitch, then asks that the thread be pulled through, not yanked. No one applauds. The room exhales in the exact measure justice allows. Midway, though clocks here behave like well-mannered guesses, he returns to the office of names, where clerks tend the sacred alphabet of the gone. He reads a ledger the way a farmer reads a sky watching for weather. If a family above is failing to speak a name, he makes a note. Hermes will carry a nudge into a dream, or a cat will pause in a doorway with such pointed quiet that someone will remember to set the cup and say the syllable correctly. He prefers small interventions, large ones tear cloth. A little later, at a table set back from traffic, he meets, as he often does, the queen who speaks 2 seasons with the same mouth. Their talk is the kind of administration no poet sings. Yet it is precisely this craft that makes poetry possible. They review the calendar of her goings and comings, not as jailers divide time, but as gardeners plan rotations, keeping soil generous and cities teachable. She reports the tone of the upper fields, what grief looks like this year, whether bread is remembering to rise, and they adjust a right by a thumb's width, so households may learn gentleness without letting duty fray. In the afternoon he walks the corridor of repairs, a suite of rooms the world rarely imagines. Here, promises are mended like chairs, a son learns how to hold his father's name without bruising it. A thief returns, in emblem, if not in coin, what hunger took. A quarrel is taught to become a story that instructs rather than an acid that keeps burning. He is not a therapist, he is a custodian of proportion. Where punishment once thundered, he has installed a quieter machine that teaches balance. If Tartarus must be checked, he goes alone. He carries no fear with him, only exactness. The locks are old and do not lie. He touches each and listens for fatigue in the metal, ordering a hinge replaced where the note runs sharp. Even severity avoids display. Quarantine must never learn to love its power. As the light that isn't light lengthens, he visits the stables. The horses, dusk dark, workmanlike, answer with a single stamp that sounds like a respectful greeting. He walks to the gate and sets his palm to the iron. It keeps the day's warmth like a distant hearth. Sometimes he closes his eyes there, not praying exactly, but practicing the very attention he asks of doors. Open only on the right note. Refuse only what harms. Remember that both tasks belong to love. Letters arrive from above. Torches carried at Eleusis. a field that remembered its cue earlier than expected, a baker who added a ceremonial pinch of patience to his dough and proved that bread listens when addressed kindly. He files these not as proofs of rule but as evidence of reciprocity, and it pleases him more than he will admit to see policy translated into tenderness by households. Evening, if we may call it that, where lamps teach the day how to end, finds him again at the table of ledgers, reading what has come and what must be expected with a gaze neither hawk-eyed nor lax, the attention of a keeper who understands that order is a form of hospitality. The helm rests on its stand, the sceptre composed as if made from rest itself. Before the last duties, he walks with her through a garden under deliberate stars, a horticulture of memory, narcissus that reflect like polished thought, a plot of barley to honour instruction, small laurel whose leaves learn courage by proximity. They say little, presence is a language bedded by silence. Somewhere in the distance a bell gives its single note, the day's last hinge finding home, and he thinks of all the rooms above where people practice the underworld's courtesy without knowing its name, keys laid where a hand can find them in the dark, a coin kept not for greed but for passage, a name spoken once, properly, so the air does not tear. Then, as if the house were remembering something old and shy, a faint perfume of oil and bread arrives from modest processions carrying his emblems, a fragrance that suggests tomorrow will begin as it should. No spectacle, just a door washed, a threshold retaught, and a hand ready to open only when the note is true. The signs that gather in this house do not clamour. They keep the courtesy of low light, teaching with touch and with the way objects remember the hands that served them. A key, for instance, is never mere hardware. It is a philosophy with teeth. In the underworld, it marks the difference between closing and excluding, the discipline of opening only when the note is true. Resting in his palm, a key looks modest, but anyone who has tended a household knows that modest tools keep a world from fraying. The sceptre shares that ethic, not a wand for spectacle, but a staff for testing plumb, a reminder that authority is an instrument of straightness. In certain precincts, the sceptre pairs with a cornucopia, a curved horn whose grammar is generosity. They call him Plouton when they want that face of the office, the fertility of soil, the return of seed, the wealth that reappears after vanishing. The horn does not glitter, it feeds. Nearby, a pomegranate waits, its red arithmetic bound to a queen who learned to speak 2 seasons without breaking her name. The fruit sits like a patient syllable on a plate, its seeds aligned like a calendar, each a small bead of treaty. Not far off, torches stand, the very figure of careful guidance. In shrines above ground they carry daylight into the memory of night, and below they make sure darkness does not mistake itself for neglect. Sometimes those torches belong to Hecate, triple-faced at the crossroad, or to attendants at Eleusis, whose choreography taught citizens that descent and return are not only beliefs, but practices the body can learn. Scholars, who tend doubts the way gardeners cultivate herbs, still murmur about what precisely the initiate saw. An ear of grain lifted, a speaking silence, a word shaped like a door, and whether the right leaned more toward a mother's grief or the sovereign below. Yet households kept the gist. Light accompanies thresholds, and thresholds must learn their manners. Keys, sceptres, torches, these are the visible grammar. The rites themselves speak more softly. Chthonic offerings do not rise, they go in. Libations, oil, honeyed wine, sometimes milk, are poured into the ground so gratitude travels by the right road. When sacrifice was the city's grammar, black animals were chosen for gods of the beneath, not out of romance with gloom, but for the exactness of address. Night recognises its own. Those without means set out a crumb on the sill, a coin by the lamp, a name spoken slowly, so the air would not tear. At graves, the domestic outposts of that deep country, families visited, like kin in a kitchen, straightening tokens, washing the stone, reciting the small civics of affection that keep rooms connected. Coins at the mouth or in the hand were never bribes for a crooked oarsman, despite later jokes, but provisions for honest passage. A fee admits that work is being done for you. The living poured and spoke downward and received in return something without flash, composure, the courage not to panic at endings, the sense that a household participates in a quiet economy of keeping. Flowers belong to this language too. Narcissus, assigned to the meadow scene, behaves like a mirror that remembers depth. Its whiteness carries shadow well. Asphodel, its name already a breath through leaves, carpets the plain of middling lives, reminding visitors that most goodness is unadvertised. Laurel grows in small groves below, the kind the house cultivates under artificial stars, has a class in durable cheer, and barley stands in ceremonial plots to recall the mother's lesson that bread rises again when grief is given its right. Unseen, but everywhere, is the emblem no sculptor can carve, pace. The pace of the house is its liturgy. Doors open when hinges are ready. Judges speak when silence has cooled the heat. The Furies, those stringent seamstresses, show their symbols in action rather than in hand. A lash need only be implied, for the true instrument is proportion. Perhaps most misread is the helm of invisibility. Tavern tales stomach it for mischief, but in the house it is an ethic. To pass without drawing attention is sometimes the kindest craft. To leave the surface unruffled while repairing the root is a form of mercy. So the helm hangs by the door as a reminder, be present without making the room smaller. There is music too, more temperature than tune, the liturgy of measured footsteps, the bell that gives a single note at necessary hours, the hush that gathers when names are correctly said. And there are the little domestic sacraments, bread set, where a shadow remembers sweetness, water placed, where a breeze can carry a greeting, a key kept, where a hand can find it in the dark. Each courtesy does more than piety. It tutors the nervous system, teaching that depth is not hostile to life. Debates wander this garden like honest weather. Some say the cornucopia is a later civic Polish, Rome dressing an older austerity in marble plenty. Others point to threshing floors older than temples and claim the horn arrived with the fields. Some argue the black ram was theatre's concession. Others insist colour is vocabulary, not mood. Whatever scholarship concludes in its patient rooms, households keep the practice that works. Pour, speak, wash, remember. Rites are habits that discovered their souls. Through the long schooling of these gestures, a culture learns that the underworld is not a rival city, but a neighbouring room whose door deserves to be kept clean. Perhaps that is why, on evenings when lamps teach walls to soften, people feel steadier without knowing why. An old symbol has done its work quietly. And beside symbol, there is place. The way caves breathe, the way rivers adopt special manners near their mouths, the way black soils hold the moon like a polished bowl. But that belongs to the map itself, to the landscapes that taught these rites their shape, where a fissure can feel like a syllable and a shoreline like a sentence left open for reply. The map that teaches a people how to speak to their depths is not first sketched on parchment. It is drafted by mountains that keep their granite vows, by rivers that prefer certain syllables, by caves where the air remembers older temperatures. In the lands that would one day call him by 3 names, the earth rehearsed his grammar in advance. Lakes wore a bluish iron patience, and craters smoked like cautions. Shepherds learned which stone mouths exhaled, a breath that made torches hesitate and birds reconsider, and at those mouths instinct arranged a courtesy. Bring bread, pour honeyed wine into the ground, speak as if the hill listened with an ear under its roots. Scholars, gently disagreeing as gardeners differ over herbs, would later note how shrines of the below favour faults and vents where the planet practices its slow speech, but long before footnotes there were fishermen and field hands who understood that thresholds prefer a definite address. In Epirus a river named for sorrow carried hush in its current, and reeds there wrote small notes against the ankles of travellers. Inland, a cavern at a cape watched 2 seas converse, and people said a door stood there, sometimes ajar, sometimes not, depending on whether the week's weather liked the tone of ships. Farther east, a court of pale stone steamed in cool mornings like a farm after rain. Animals balked, birds circled wide, and men tied scarves over their mouths, not from superstition, but because respect for breath is good shopcraft anywhere. None of this begged a proclamation. The land lectured gently in a language of inclines and mist, teaching the upper world that descent is sometimes not a verb but a place. Villagers answered with an architecture of consideration, stairs that widened near thresholds so arrivals could change their minds, wells with rims rubbed smooth by the ethic of lowering the bucket without haste, courts paved over older courts as if memory were load-bearing. In the city whose mysteries measured the calendar, barley fields learned choreography before the dancers did. Plots turned as if honouring a queen's 2 addresses. Seed practised patience, and then answered patience with plenty. Near threshing floors, families kept a corner the sun could not reach, a little grotto of shade where offerings would not wander. To strangers who loved clarity without depth, the custom looked like superstition. To those who had watched frost turn sudden and moral, it looked like good neighbourliness with the ground. Mines, too, put ink on the map. Where silver was coaxed from the earth's ribs, men returned dusk-pale and thoughtful, bearing the lesson every shaft repeats. Wealth is the child of distances one must not pretend are shallow. In such districts, the name Plouton wore its honest coat, not a robe of coin, but an apron of harvest, since metals and grain share one ancestry, vanishing, time, return. Burial mounds in quiet country stacked earth in patient syllables, each tumulus a low utterance of belonging, round as an oath. Children ran their hands along the grass and felt how memory holds a curvature different from walls. At town edges, boundary stones, those stoic citizens, kept their posts with a silence that corrects tempers. Anyone learning to swear by them felt the influence. You do not shout at rock that has earned its shape. And always the rivers. 5 carry names in lessons, but thousands carried the method. Read the A crossing persuades more firmly than decrees. The ferryman's rhythm, come, go, wait, became a civic model. And bridges learned ceremony, letting feet feel the slight lift that accompanies permission. If the land preferred an instrument, it was the hinge disguised as scenery, a ravine that asked for a change of voice, a pass that required agreements among strangers, a shoreline whose weather could veto arrogance in an hour. These places trained courtesies into habit. Processions slowed near them. Judges recessed arguments until the wind stopped bullying. Music chose a lower key. Even constellations seen from certain sheepfolds seemed to bend nearer, ready to hear a story better told under less light. Rumour embroidered the rest, as rumour will, declaring that the god's house could be entered by any fisher if one knew the password. But households doing the real work kept to simple proofs. If a cave breathed oddly, they brought a careful lamp and listened. If a spring ran warm in winter, they cupped it, like an elder's hand, and said the names it might be missing. If a slope echoed twice at dusk, and never at noon, children bowed there, as they would to an aunt whose recipes, you finally admit, saved your life. In time, builders signed treaties with these behaviours. Temples learned to keep a room underground, not as spectacle, but as plumbing for feeling. Altars wore the honest soot of oil and ghee poured into cracks. Floors were pierced with small mouths that could drink a libation without making a scene of it. To hurried eyes, the city above looked ordinary. To the trained, it spoke a citizen's vocabulary of depth. And the land was not only a tutor of kindness, it kept its teeth where needed. Cliff, flood, and sudden fall taught mortals that promises to the below must be kept with weather's punctuality. On nights when the sea rehearsed its iron, and the wind rearranged roofs into new opinions, men and women rediscovered the comfort of laws that travel with torches. Thresholds became civic as much as private. Court sills were washed like kitchen sills, and the gestures that protected bread protected testimony. Geography had matured into jurisprudence. Under that education, the keeper god of rooms did little more than approve wisdom already present in the hills. He walked, as often, along a subterranean colonnade, whose fluting sounded like water turning into thought, and with one finger traced the fine grit where stone meets floor. Above, on an unsuspecting hillside, a shepherd paused with the taste of iron placed on his tongue by the ground, a weather of the soul, and turned his flock with the same gravity a judge uses to return a case to deliberation. Elsewhere, a child testing a cave with a candle learned how flame leans toward air and how a small bow can be a language entire. Evening drew its blue on both maps at once, and far off a front advanced whose edge would press cities into decision, the kind that asks not only for symbols and terrain, but for the making and keeping of alliances when a world remembers that thresholds belong to everyone. Power in the old stories changes hands, less by coup than by calibration, more like a river accepting its banks than a king mislaying his crown. And in the deep country, conflict and alliance were remembered as the craft of keeping thresholds honest. The first settlement, the brothers' apportioning of sky, sea, and the below, was diplomacy wearing the mask of chance, lots drawn so that the shock of division could be sung. Within that treaty, the underworld adopted a temperament unsuited to parade. It would govern by proportion rather than pageant, so most of its conflicts were arguments about pace. When heroes knocked carrying errands, or a little hubris in their pockets, policy inhaled before answering. Heracles arrived with a labour shaped like a question. May a living man handle a creature of endings without unseating the office that tends those endings? The answer, tempered like iron, warmed just enough to bend, was supervised. Borrowing, Cerberus permitted above, on the condition that the living learn to return what is not theirs. Orpheus pled in a music that made stone lean. The counter-argument was law. Love may be escorted to the lip of day, but no one outruns the hinge without tearing it. Hence, a single rule, do not look back, installed like a plumb line. And when he broke it, not as cruelty but as geometry, the corridor kept its shape. Other failures were blunter. Theseus and his intoxicated companion tested the house as boys test a dam, by jumping on it. The underworld replied with the carpenter's lesson: sit, wait, think about weight. Sisyphus, bargaining with the economy of endings as if it were a cornerable market, enrolled in the school of forever and learned how repetition sands the varnish off cleverness. Tantalus and Ixion found that theft and betrayal do not dissolve in the dark. They clarify into tasks. None of this was spectacle. It was a workshop where consequences were fitted back into their frames. Alliances, meanwhile, were laid like keels, quietly, with storms in mind. Hermes, exact friend of thresholds, remained the house's surest colleague, translating mercy into procedure and procedure back into mercy so that traffic could move without tearing. Hecate, keeper of triple ways, extended the jurisdiction of torchlight so choice could see itself. With her, the queen felt an elder sister's arm at dusk. The Furies, so often miscast as chaos, proved to be the seamstresses of community. When cities above would not prosecute harms done at the root, these stern aunts resumed their office and stitched the rip until justice could wear its garment without shame. Even Zeus, whose thunder enjoys rearranging calendars, deferred when the treaty of seasons required it. A mother's governance, a daughter's portion, and the steward below together taught the king of weather to love a schedule. Power also shifted in subtler ways, the kind historians mark with a penciled star, as fields and mines taught mortals to think in cycles and stores. The wealth-bearing epithet moved forward. Plouton took precedence over Hades, not to prettify dread, but to name accurately the economy he administered, grain returning after vanishing, or entering daylight at sane rates, cities financing ritual with gratitude rather than panic. In the Hellenistic and Roman centuries, when marble found its civic voice, Pluto and Disparta were seated in more public rooms, yet the old house did not lose itself in new titles. The cornucopia fed before it gleamed. The key reminded that opening is a duty, not a thrill. There were treaties with households that felt almost like marriages. Each year a portion of attention, like a portion of harvest, would go below. Families that kept such pacts found winters less cruel and springs less forgetful. Those who mocked them discovered that neglect, like mould, prefers the unwatched corner. Even episodes that look like war in brasher myths, the chaining of older titans, the sealing of Tartarus, were handled with the restraint of quarantine. Victory is a bad habit in rooms meant for healing. When conflict arrived in coin rather than sword, new economies tempting cities to dig too fast, to spend the future's ribs on the present's feast, the alliance answered with rights and law, mining decrees measured against rivers' patience, harvest festivals reminding hands of the depth that saved their bread, fines translated into offerings that repaired more than treasuries. Scholars still hum their low debate about whether Orphic schools or the Eleusinian calendar shifted power from fear to trust. Perhaps they merely named courtesies households already practiced. What can be said without swagger is this: the politics below were the craft of keeping circulation honest. Force was used as a surgeon uses instruments, precise, reluctant, grateful to set them down. Authority was the ability to make a room calmer by entering it. And succession, if one may use that word for gods, was not a ladder climbed over shoulders, but a bench widened, so a queen could sit beside a steward and teach his exactness the shape of seasons. In the end, the deepest alliance was struck with time itself. He agreed to keep what time brought. Time agreed to return what keeping had ripened. From that pact came a civilization's quiet confidence that endings are not confiscations but exchanges, which is why, when trade winds shifted and ships carried heavier cargoes, grain, silver, stories. People felt the deep house steady beneath every deck, balancing accounts without applause. Somewhere, to underline the point, a coin stamped with a horn of plenty tips in a palm, remembering the mine it came from and the harvest it sponsors, while in a dusk-lit field a farmer tests a seed between two fingers and listens for the soft answer of worth. Wealth in his jurisdiction was not a heap but a circulation, and those who learned his economy did so as bakers learn heat, by watching what rises and what refuses. Below, ledgers balanced more than coin. They tallied return. Grain was the first currency and the last, each kernel a small oath to the deep arithmetic that turns vanishing into bread. Fields spoke this dialect through their roots, lending winter their patience and receiving spring's interest in green, and the house beneath, by keeping endings honest, guaranteed that trust could be extended year after year without collapse. Metals were a sterner ledger. Silver and gold did not glitter here. They set like bone. In the mind's lungs, a pyx ring bore the same morality as a vow: do not strike faster than the rock can answer. When ore reached daylight, he preferred it minted into promises rather than hoarded into appetites. Ancient coins, some bearing a horn of plenty, others a key or a barley stalk, travelled like little treaties between strangers. A market could be made civil by such treaties. For when a horn feeds, a key opens rightly, and barley reminds the hand that bread is shared work. Merchants learn that profit and fairness are spouses who take turns speaking. Trade routes, those long threads the world taught itself to braid, understood his pace better than statutes. Crossing a pass, caravans bowed to the law of weather. Skirting a ravine, they practiced humility that doubles as insurance. At river mouths, where reeds wrote small notes against ankles, ferries timed their traffic to the water's breath, and the fee, never arbitrary when the boatman was in temper, acknowledged that labour is not an insult, but a dignity that asks to be named. In ports, nets rose silvered with the day's arithmetic, and the tithe set aside for rights was not a superstition tax, but a service contract. With the below, keep the cycles clean, and the sea will remember the difference between enough and too much. Households kept cottage versions of these compacts. A cup of oil poured into the ground in autumn, a loaf's heel left at the threshold in winter, a name spoken in the corner where the draft remembers, investments whose returns arrived as composure, as fewer quarrels over small bread, as doors that stuck less when storms showed their teeth. Even the poor, who could not afford oxen for altars or elaborate graves, budgeted in the soft currency of attention, washing a stone, straightening a token, teaching a child the syllables that put a lost person back in the room. Cities enlarged the same grammar. The mysteries at Bali's sanctuary ran on an economy of trust, grain reserved in hunger years to fund a ritual that taught hope to hold still, torches purchased and trimmed by guilds that knew light, too, must be paid for. Initiates offered fees not to buy immunity from sorrow, but to keep alive the choreography that turns sorrow towards spring. Courts levied fines, and sometimes a portion was translated into offerings below, not to flatter a god, but to mend a fabric. When money moves in a circle that includes thresholds, thresholds stop biting ankles. Temples kept donation books with a thrift any grandmother would praise, shunning waste the way a careful cook avoids burning onions, knowing how quickly bitterness travels. He read these ledgers without smugness. A culture that treats wealth as a timetable rather than a trophy will feed children without courting famine. A city that pays ferrymen on time will cross crises more safely than one that reneges and tries to be clever at the water's edge. Extravagance, in this economy, looked less like banquets than impatience, digging too fast, spending seed, asking summer of the river when it is winter's turn. His corrections were rarely theatrical, a mind closed for a season, so the veins could rest. A market required its weights tested at dawn, under a public torch. A tithe calendar shifted so festivals landed where hungry months needed reminding that joy, too, is provision. Stories about misers and prodigals learned to share a bench. The misers' chests were taught the language of keys that open outward. The prodigal's feet were taught the language of gates that love you enough to delay you. Above all, he disliked waste, not for moral flourish, but for physics. Every excess is a theft from a neighbour not yet met, so he favoured crafts that turn leftovers into structure. Potters using oil jar sherds to true a doorframe, masons bedding coins in thresholds so each step remembers reciprocity, scribes copying a child's name in the margin of a deed to say, quietly, that property is a conversation with time. There were luxuries he approved, sleep paid fairly, mourning budgeted without apology, festivals whose cost served as down payment on years without riots, and luxuries he distrusted, glitter that begged to be seen more than it wished to serve, monuments that stole stone from bridges, ships that carried vanity heavier than grain. When empires rose and tried to teach the world that wealth is noise, his house persisted by example, ledgers exact, gates honest, wages punctual, torches trimmed. Visitors named this temperate administration prosperity. He preferred to call it right weight. In the gardens below, he walked with her between barley and laurel, counting not coins but returns, a widow who slept a full night because a debt was untangled, a ferryman who smiled once a week after benches were moved into the light, a field green again because the village kept faith with the threshing floor. Such bookkeeping would not impress a conqueror, but it would feed a harbour for generations. As the day's numbers settled into their modest truths, he laid his palm on the iron of the gate and felt the faint warmth travelling down from commerce above, mule sweat, bread heat, coin friction, the temperature of honest work, and thought how every market, listened to long enough, sounds like a bell giving one clear sufficient note. Far off in a lamplit room, a tailor smoothed a seam on a shroud that would soon be needed, and upstairs a child tried on new sandals, the leather whispering its promise to last. The economy had done its quiet work, and somewhere, on the edge of sleep, tools settled themselves in order, ready by morning to become the language of hands that keep a world. Cloth, stone, and iron learned the house's manners until objects themselves kept the underworld's ethics stitched beneath their seams. In rooms where lamps were trimmed to an oval of patient light, garments hung with the composure of instruments put away correctly, wool that remembered the meadow without boasting of it, linen that kept the crisp whisper of water, and a cunning weave of darker fibres reserved for those long corridors where brightness would interrupt the sentence. He favoured fabrics the way a craftsman favours verbs, for what they do, not how they pose. The queen, who spoke 2 seasons with the one mouth, liked hems that carried small alphabets, barley stitched like a quiet thesis along the edge, a key rendered so tiny only the wearer felt its tooth against the shin, a border of pomegranate dots whose arithmetic could pass for vines to anyone unpractised in counting. Above, in houses that kept faith with below, mourning clothes served not as theatre but as pedagogy. Dyes softened with ash, threads left a shade looser at the wrist to remind the hand to move gently through a changed room. And when the hour for loosening grief arrived, colour rejoined the body, not as revolt, but as remembering, like a field taking green again because the calendar has been honoured. Tools answered in the same grammar. A spade is an argument with earth, but here even arguments learn tone. Handles oiled until the wood felt like a friend's palm. Blades sharpened to the point where effort and result could trust each other. Keys, of course, were the signature craft, cut with a temper that refused gaudiness. Their teeth were essays in proportion, one to remind a door not to panic, another to teach a gate to refuse the wrong hurry, a final notch to allow mercy without surrendering structure. The locksmiths filed in silence. Superstition, some said. Respect for thresholds learning their sound, said others. Hammers carried weight, honestly. Chisels told the truth to stone without shouting. Awls opened only the holes the thread required, no more, no less. When mortals carved funerary reliefs above, the best of them seemed to borrow this workshop's ethos, hands reaching yet stopping a breath apart. Eyes trained not on melodrama, but on the space where memory would later sit. Architecture showed the ethic most visibly. The house of kept rooms was not a chandeliered vision, but a school of pacing translated into stone. Corridors were proportioned to teach footsteps patience. Stairs widened a fraction at the turn so burdens could choose comfort without apology. Lintels sat low enough to nod the head into courtesy. In great halls, columns bore weight with a benevolence that made listeners braver. Fluting gathered air into a soft hum like water deciding to think. Entablatures refused ornaments that might quarrel with balance. The judge's chamber set benches where acoustics favoured truth rather than volume. The porch of remorse admitted light from the side, so confession could forget theatrics and remember usefulness. Even Tartarus, sealed far and stern, wore severity as function, not spectacle, hinges proportioned for honesty, locks retired before fatigue could teach them to lie. Above ground, cities that kept the treaty adapted these proportions to kitchens and courts. Thresholds set a thumb lower for the old and the grieving. Hearths raised a palm's width, so bread could be watched without bending anger into the back. Well rims taught the rope how not to fray. Scholars, bending over their lamps, still debate gentle questions, whether corniced keys and grain on civic buildings were devotion or fashion, whether black gloss lekythoi with quiet parting hands were piety, or a market discovering the charm of restraint. The debates are kind, like tailors discussing seams, and either way, the best objects kept their vow. Sturdy before beautiful, and because of that, beautiful. Music took architecture's side. Lutes and flutes were tuned a hair lower in sanctuaries that rehearsed descent and return. Drums learned to walk like torches. One measured throb, a breath, another throb, no bragging. When the Queen's festival practiced ascent, stairwells answered with a scale that held back its brightness until the last landing. When she returned to the deep country, the same notes turned inward and found harmonies that comforted shelves, as if jars and ledgers slept better for lullabies. Even bowls proved that ethics considered a table. Lips thickened slightly so oil would pour without skitter, handles shaped for a widow's tired grasp, pitchers with spouts that found their target as a promise finds its due date. The cornucopia, carved in sober relief where civic grain was measured, showed fruit that looked like work rather than boasting. The horn's curve suggested the turn of a road home. In the workshops, apprentices learned a catechism of touch. Do not plane wood past its strength. Do not polish stone until it forgets it was mountain. Do not decorate what must decide. Bring benches nearer light for eyes that have earned gentleness. Oil what must move. Respect what must hold. People say the Queen added one principle. Leave room for the traveller who cannot say from which direction she has come. So furniture acquired the habit of an extra chair angled toward the door, and lamp wicks were trimmed with the stranger in mind. Even in armour, the underworld refused swagger. Helms remembered the ethic of invisibility as restraint. Greaves fit the leg without teaching it pride. A simple iron ring served as a vow to proportion. On certain evenings, the sovereign walked the long gallery, where objects waded between uses, passing a palm along a shelf to test not dust, but spirit. Had a tool been asked to be more than it should? Had a decoration usurped a decision's place? Disorder drew no scold. He rearranged. One thing returned to usefulness, another to tenderness, a third to storage, where rest is part of function. Above, households mirrored the craft. A dish placed on the threshold, not to impress the unseen, but to practice joinery between rooms. A door rehung to close, with the sound of consent rather than complaint. A shawl folded in the shape of care. Everywhere, the quiet education continued. Stone teaching knees to bend without humiliation, keys teaching hands to open without conquest, cloth teaching bodies to grieve without unravelling. Toward the day's late blue, when workshops let tools remember their sheaths and corridors cooled to the temperature of kept promises. A bell gave its single note, and the house's architecture seemed to breathe. Under artificial stars, barley made a small sound like thinking. A spool of thread turned a fraction after the hand had lifted. And far above, in a small room where someone had just set down a name with precision and love, a door closed softly, as if a hinge had learned a prayer. Stories about him do not run in a single lane. They braid, and the braid holds because each strand keeps the same temper. Endings are not confiscations, but conversions. Keeping is a species of love, and the dark is a workshop with its lamp turned low. Most households begin with the meadow, hinge disguised as flower, a mother whose grief arranges the calendar, a daughter who learns to speak two addresses without tearing her name. Yet even within that melody, the harmonics multiply softly, heard best when the room is quiet. In one village, the fruit is a single seed, a ruby comma binding her to the sentence of return. Elsewhere, 6 beads click like a small abacus, dividing the year with tenderness. In other places, the number is left uncounted because some cultures prefer a treaty felt as weather rather than scored as mathematics. Tones vary by terrain. Some call the descent a theft and the ascent an uprising. Others speak of apprenticeship. The below is a school that confers a second crown. Scholars, the patient gardeners of uncertainty, trace these shadings along trade routes and threshing floors, noting how a people who have tasted famine favour the version where winter is instruction, not punishment, and how a city wary of tyrants stresses choice and the right to come home. The house below accepts these tellings as a good instrument welcomes different hands, provided the song's spine stays true. Around that spine, other myths test the gates in their own keys. Orpheus arrives with music that makes hinges lean. His compact, "Do not look back," feels so human that centuries later readers still press a palm to the chest at the instant it fails. Some call the failure cruelty. Others answer that law must keep its shape, or love will not know where to sit. The underworld's telling is gentler, the pact kept precisely, the lesson straight as a plumb line. Trust walks forward. Heracles comes bearing iron-coloured work. In most strands he borrows the triple-headed warden, on condition that what is taken is returned and that spectacle is refused. It is a myth about strength that obeys instructions, about a door that opens to the living when the request is exact and the purpose clean. Theseus and his emboldened companion try the furniture as boys try a dam, by jumping on it, and are taught the carpenter's rule: sit, wait, consider weight. Sisyphus bright as a knife used for the wrong task, bargains with the economy of endings, and is enrolled in a graduate course called repetition until cleverness learns humility's shape. Ixion, Tantalus, each offence is not so much punished as fitted to its own echo, like a room returning a note until the singer recognises his tone. The dusk widens to the softer tales where lovers' names live. Minter, whose syllables still taste of cool leaves, boasts too loudly in one thread and learns that boasting is poor gardening. In another, she is transformed as a shield against humiliation, kept not as scold, but as remedy, steeped for breath and calm, and the stomachs of the grieving. Loose, white poplar, with feet in both soils, becomes a gift to places of wrestling and practice. Her leaves, flashing dark and bright in one wind, teach athletes the grammar of crossing. These kitchen-near stories reveal a house skilled at turning awkwardness into use. Deeper still, a child's name flickers like a fish, Zagreus. To some he belongs to a thunder king's plan to seed new order. To others, he is an older flame borrowed by later poets. The underworld hangs no banners. What matters is whether a tale helps a household carry grief without breaking its plates. On that count, even the wildest versions are welcomed, then asked to lower their voices until their usefulness can be heard. Some myths step sideways into philosophy. Plouton, giver of wealth, is paired in certain hymns with Ploutos, the slippery spirit of windfall. Citizens are warned not to confuse a horn that feeds with a hand that dazzles and disappears. In workshops by lamplight, a simpler test suffices. Wealth is what returns, luck is what misbehaves. The helmet that erases footprints wanders through several errands. Athena lends it here, Hermes there, and tavern tellers make mischief of it. But the house keeps the quieter rule. Invisibility as restraint, the craft of passing without roughing the surface while repairing the route. Even dogs know this language. Cerberus, rumour's monster, is here a colleague with a job, nose for thresholds, patience for routines, a bark reserved for those who refuse to learn. Other strands glint at the edge, a scalaphus in the orchard, Pirate House, and the chair that teaches second thoughts. Anchises buried with care, and Aeneas guided with equal care. Each threads the same principle through a different weave, proportion over drama, a mirror that dims the glare and brightens the quiet until character can read its face. Variants are not errors, they are climates. To sailors the story tastes of salt and ore, to ploughmen it smells of rain on soil. To city lawyers, it carries the flavour of ledgers and oaths. The keeper below does not correct accent so long as the sentence keeps faith with its verb. Keep. Keep promises, keep names, keep pace, keep the door learning both duties, welcome and refusal, in equal measure. Later centuries may polish the tales in marble, or bend them into plays. The old house does not complain. Spectacle has its season. It asks only that once the audience is gone and the actors unpainted, someone in the kitchen remembers the small rites, a crumb for the threshold, a cup of clean water near a draught, a name said once, properly, so the air does not tear. Then the myths, sung in high rooms or whispered under blankets, resume their oldest task, teaching a people to live bravely with both doors in mind. Outside, wind moves through poplars and teaches the leaves to show both faces. Somewhere, a grandmother sets a seed on her tongue to feel its number, while a lamp studies the table and learns the exact circle of light it should keep. Before there were manuals, there were mothers at thresholds and elders who could hear the weather changing inside a clay jar. Survival, in those valley farms and early cities, was not doctrine, but a braid of indigenous knowledges that read the deep country's temperament and arranged life so breath would go on. Children were taught to keep keys where a hand could find them in the dark, not only because doors must be managed, but because a mind rests when tools have homes. They were taught the order of naming, who is spoken before meals, who is remembered at the well, because a household that carries its dead correctly walks straighter in storms. Seed was measured by story rather than greed. A grandmother poured barley from one palm to another and hummed the tale of a girl dividing her year, and the rhythm of that humming told the family how much to keep, how much to risk, how much to set aside in cool earth that remembers. In famine years, people did not merely tighten belts, they widened courtesies. Threshold loaves appeared, small, dense, meant for sharing at the door, and the door learned to be a scale measuring fairness. First the widow, then the new father, then the stranger still learning the Alice grammar. Wells had liturgies. Draw in silence at dawn so the water can arrive in one piece. Speak a name of gratitude before the rope's last creak. If a quarrel has moved into your house, pause one heartbeat with the bucket held just above the lip and let the day lower its voice. Grief had its fieldcraft too, for grief is weather. The first 7 nights after a death, lamps stood where draughts could carry their mild courage into corners. Chairs were turned a finger's width toward the door so the room would not feel trapped. Shawls were folded in a shape that taught hands to move gently. Children learned to say the gone without tearing the air, and to lay a crumb on the threshold as if feeding a thin, shy animal that must be calmed until the house relearned its balance. When sorrow stamped or broke plates, elders escorted it to the temple's porch of remorse and let stone absorb what wood could not bear. In plague, herbs became letters. Mint was steeped for breath and for the panic that closes the throat. Laurel hung in narrow doorways to dress the air with undramatic courage. Pomegranate peel, dried and shaved, went into broths for mouths refusing bread, a flavour like a second chance. Doors were washed at dusk with water saved from the keenest part of morning, because a day that greets a door properly is less likely to end in shouting for sleep. Hypnos' modest kingdom, where bodies repair and tempers step out of armour, families kept a choreography that was almost law. Bank the fire to a whisper, lay the key flat on a saucer so it will not make nervous sounds, say the names that must be said once, properly, and then do not speak. When caravans crossed hills, scouts read rock as scribes read deeds, listening for pitch underfoot, watching how dust behaves near cave mouths. A proverb travelled with them. If the ridge takes your weight, without comment, repay it with your quiet. Offerings at passes were small, crumbs, oil, a pinch of salt, because a pass prefers acknowledgement to theatre. In mines, a foreman rested his palm on a vein and let silence count to 7 before the first strike. If the metal felt impatient, work paused and a fugger of wine was poured into a crack to remind the mountain it was being addressed as colleague, not hostage. Debt, that other mine, had rights as well. Had, on the new moon, creditor and debtor touched the same key and forgave the width of one tooth, a tiny mercy that kept ledgers from growing claws. A judge trained in the deep country kept a bowl of water at his bench and dipped his fingers after each sentence, cooling the impulse to punish past repair. During war, cities did not forget kitchens. A woman chalked a circle by the oven and wrote inside it the names of those gone to fight. Bread baked beside that circle rose steadier, and children ate without vomit thoughts. When fathers returned, if they returned, they found the circle carefully smudged with a sleeve, the sign that a threshold's promise had been kept. Roads had their strategies. Walk a river as you walk a rumour. Upstream first for origins, downstream for conclusions. Pay the ferryman even if he is your cousin. Work worth doing deserves to be named. If fog lifts from a hollow as if the ground were considering a thought, do not sleep there. Cook there, yes, feed the earth's musing, but make your bed where the stone looks bored. When law failed, aunties older than law appeared, the Furies living echoes, stern women with the right to interrupt. They sat at corners where boys tried to swagger, and with one look returned the street to proportion. They were paid in bread and first news, and a city that forgot to honour them soon found its benches growing crooked. Festivals doubled as emergency drills. The Queen's return was welcomed with a scale that trained feet to move together. Torches practised, passing hand to hand without spilling, so in real fires, bravery would already live in the fingers. Her departure was marked by closures done kindly. Lid set, locks tried, kitchen knives turned point in, so that in famine or siege households would remember how to reduce brightness without meanness. Hermes' craft became domestic art. Parents taught the dialect of thresholds, how to knock with the rhythm that says, I come for lawful reasons. How to cross a room without making it smaller. How to carry news as if carrying a bowl filled to the brim. And in dreams, letters delivered to the inside, people learned to heat a corridor with a bell at the far end. Wake, move the bench 2 steps near a light, pour a thimble of oil for the name you are avoiding, oil the hinge before it learns to sing bitterness. None of this was grand. That was the point. Survival hid in good housekeeping of the soul. In every village, a woman knew where grain should sleep, so it would not learn fear. A man knew how to make a door argue less with wind. A child knew which words to say to a stone. Beneath it all, the deep country kept its part, holding what was entrusted, returning what had ripened, keeping the lamp low so eyes would not be dazzled away from the work. Toward evening, when hills decide colour is a conversation rather than a fact, you might see on a road that remembers hooves, a family going home with looser shoulders, a key resting on a palm as if taking the air, a loaf cooling beside a chalk circle, and above them a thin moon practising restraint, while somewhere below a bell gives one patient note, and the earth, satisfied by courtesy, lets night arrive without teeth. When roads lengthened and ships learned the grammar of routes, his house, quiet as breath behind a closed door, found itself conversing with horizons it had never tried to impress, and the meeting proved less a conquest than a translation. Merchants carried barley and silver, and without knowing it, folded rights among their wares, a crumb for the threshold tucked into a ledger, a key rubbed smooth by fingers that trusted doors to mean what they said. In harbour towns where the tide tutors clocks, the name that stresses wealth, Plouton, spoke more readily than the name that prefers to be veiled. People balancing cargo by moonlight needed a god who understood return, so the cornucopia travelled on coins and seals like a portable sermon kept in a purse. Across straits, where marble learned to imitate water, the Romans, practical as millers, answered with Disparta and Pluto, clothing the deep country in civic fabric without ripping the old cut. They raised arches that behaved like gates and wrote treaties with fields as they wrote treaties with neighbours, setting the horn that feeds beside the key that opens as if to say prosperity and order must be married if a city is to sleep well. Elsewhere the conversation grew older and stranger. Sailors who had watched sunsets in languages not their own spoke of underworlds in bronze masks and rivers named like dates and burnt cedar, stewards below wore lion shoulders or bull horns, or a queen signed the law with a crescent hand. The house listened, without defensiveness, knowing depth changes costume from valley to valley while learning the same music. Whether a gate is guarded by a dog with 3 patient heads or by a net of names, the hinge still asks for courtesy, and the crossing still asks a fare. Travellers home from Blackstone ways in the east told of descents staged like edicts, and of a goddess whose anger taught the year to fold. The mother above these stories nodded as one salutes a cousin. Grief that organises seasons is family anywhere. Envoys and poets brought further correspondences. A lord with a wolf's calm beneath northern firs. A helmed figure whose hall glowed with a fair cold light. On far coasts, hills that open to music and sea bargains counted in storms. Scholars will later call it syncretism. Households called it hospitality. Letting your door learn a new visitor's footstep without forgetting your mother's greeting. Not all meetings were smooth. Empires like to parade certainty, and certainty dislikes low light. Loud temples declared fear the only honest guard. Marble scolded with its shine. His ethic, proportion, pace, housekeeping looked provincial beside the trumpet of conquest. Yet by night, when parades dry into dust, kitchens honoured the same old treaty. Wash a name, pour a sip, keep the key where a hand can find it in the dark. Travelling schools stitched mystery to map. The Orphics with their thin gold leaves, the Eleusinian processions with their lamp-led choreography, offering portable manners to tenements and tents, a lamella whispering instructions over a hut, the memory of careful torches turning a city stairwell into a ritual of safety, an ear of grain lifted to tune a soldier's courage toward the bravery that does not need noise. Even philosophers, carpenters of thought who prefer chairs to couches, joined the chorus. Some said the soul was a bird catching thermals, others a spark seeking native fire. The house below did not referee. It cared chiefly that no one panicked when the door changed rooms. If the Stoic asked for order, the Epicurean for peace, the Platonist for a ladder, order, peace, and ladders were furniture already kept tidy. Meanwhile, coins stamped in far cities found their way home to graves rubbed by hands that never left their hill. A horn of plenty on one side and a ruler's head on the other made an honest confession. Time governs, return feeds. Languages worked patiently too. Aidoneus, the veiled, travelled as euphemism through legal codes. To go down, to be gathered, to be kept. Pluto's open palm appeared in edicts regulating grain. On stage, gods wore masks and walked to music, and crowds, softened by the grammar of spectacle, believed for an hour that even kings bow to the house that keeps accounts. Afterward, under torches, someone poured a little wine on stone and muttered the right names, and policy turned quietly into supper. Misunderstandings left pebbles in history's shoe. Some heard wealth and mistook greed. Some met the helm and thought vanishing a party trick. Some read the meadow of middling souls as trivial when it is the spine of civilizations. But time corrects where arguments cannot. Famine taught flamboyant gods humility. War taught proud courts the use of low light and ledgers. Migrations trained neighbourhoods to pack right small. In those crossings, his office showed a particular grace. He allowed himself to be translated into what people could bear without abandonment, an ancestor's kitchen, a courtroom's pause, an orchard's wintering, so that far from home a person might recognise his manners and relax into being kept. Through it all, the Queen's calendar stitched borders with the needle of return. Her comings and goings taught Mount villages and delta cities to measure in seasons, not slogans, to grant grief its quarter, so joy would not be shallow, to honour the portion of the year that listens more than it speaks. By the late centuries, when marble cracked and roads forgot their engineers, what endured was not the brass of empire, but the domestic courage the meetings had taught. A grandmother in a ruined port, still pouring a sip for the ground, a mason in a shrinking town, still betting a coin, under a threshold, a child in a borrowed alley, saying a name once properly, so the air would not tear. And somewhere, in the quiet between languages, a horn of plenty finished its curve into a new palm. A key settled on a saucer, as if it had always belonged there, and a torch remembered how to be carried without spilling. Signs that even now a legacy was learning to live above with the same proportion that keeps the rooms below in order. His legacy today arrives less as a statue than as a manner, the way a city lowers its voice near certain doors, the way a family says a name once, properly, so the air will not tear. Walk any modern street tuned to his frequency, and the traces gather like small well-made tools. A key hung where a hand can find it in the dark, a bench moved 2 steps nearer the light in a hospital corridor. The quiet choreography of a hospice nurse who knows how to draw a curtain without stealing dignity. Cemeteries have learned his temper more surely than temples, paths curved to slow the foot, stones that keep their information without insisting, trees that show both faces of their leaves when a breeze considers them. Even in cities that swear they have forgotten myth, thresholds remember him. Code books translate his ethic into prose, panic bars that yield to a single motion, stairwells that teach descent without fear, exit lights that carry a torch's grammar into fluorescent. Courts, at their best, inherit his pace. A judge who sets a sentence in a pause before speaking is practicing an old rite, as if truth were a temperature and the room must let heat fall before it can be just. Restorative justice, the careful mending of cloth instead of the theatrical tearing of it, bears his handwriting in the margins. The Furies' living nieces sit in circles with pens and listening faces, asking for proportion rather than spectacle. In households, the treaty survives as housekeeping with a soul. The little dish by the door for keys is not merely a convenience, it is the mind's agreement with thresholds to behave. The cup of water left on a sill certain evenings is an instinct that outlived its explanation. Someone once taught the house to keep company with the below, and the house remembers. On autumn counters, the pomegranate appears, not as omen, but as food that still tells a story. Its red arithmetic can taste like a calendar, and children bite the seeds and grin stains that look, oddly, like a vow kept. Mint grows stubborn in neglected corners. An old rumour of a nymph who learned the safer shape of presents, and people pick it for breath, for tea, for the soft discipline of endings done kindly. Museums, those public attics of remembering, show black glazed pottery where hands reach yet stop a breath apart. Visitors tilt their heads and feel a quiet order speak. In a corner case, a thin gold leaf bears instructions so small the eye must lean into patience. Hold your breath, and a torch-trained procession seems to pass, careful with light, returning a traveller to the right door. Architecture around grief has learned his accent, memorials sober without cruelty, rooms designed so sorrow keeps its posture. Designers borrow water for memory and stone for honesty, avoid loudness, and set exits where feet can find them without choosing drama. In hospitals, doors whisper shut with the sound of consent, and the best wards budget silence the way kitchens budget salt. Even accountants, far from ledgers carved in rock, balance more than numbers when they are wise. They listen for return in cash flow and resist the extravagance called haste. The cornucopia survives in policy more than in carving when cities decide prosperity is a timetable, food cycles, sleep cycles, work cycles, and write schedules that let children eat before learning and workers rest before heroics. In neighbourhoods where every door knows the others by sound, elders who never heard of Eleusis still keep the mysteries by another name, teaching children to pass a candle without spilling, to take stairs at night in a rhythm that keeps knees safe and tempers loyal, to say the word gone without smashing the plate. Vigil lights in windows, chalk circles on sidewalks where someone was taken too soon, quilts pieced from shirts that remember a certain shoulder. These are his modern rites, unsuperstitious and exact. Music keeps a trace. Even in concerts where loudness is the profession, there is the moment before bow meets string, the hush that teaches attention. And in funeral choirs, the altos hold a note that refuses to panic, a door-toned pitch fit to tutor any hinge. Language preserves him in gentler euphemisms, past kept, laid to rest, and in the clean bravery of saying dead when clarity is the kindest cloth. Law codes hide him in due process and chain of custody, domesticating the ethic of keys and gates for archives and evidence. Even the internet, allergic as it seems to thresholds, shows his influence when designers respect pace, confirmations that ask if you truly mean to erase, undo histories that keep what you thought discarded, permissions that give keys only to ears tuned for hinges. When storms take cities apart, his old housekeeping returns openly. Neighbours knock with Hermes cadence, stairwells carry torches again, LED now, but manners survive the material, and bread becomes sacrament instead of photograph. At the scale of the self, therapy rooms and midnight kitchens host his classroom. Someone learns to sit with what hurts without exiling it, to divide the year so winter belongs to the plan, to understand that grief is not a vandal, but a teacher with strict hands. The smallest emblems persist. A stone in a pocket to remember gravity, a plain ring to honour proportion, a list of names whispered before sleep so the day can end without debt. He is still translated on other shores, into saints, into their shadows, into secular virtues that behave like saints after the candles are gone. None of it requires belief, it requires courtesy. A door washed, a key given its saucer, a road taught to lower its speed beside a field of names. And so the quiet legacy ripples through kitchens, courtrooms, studios, code bases, gardens, hospitals, a shared agreement to open only when the note is right, to close only what harms, to keep what is entrusted without boasting. Toward evening, as windows learn the soft square of lamplight and someone folds a shawl in the shape of care, a child presses a seed into soil and asks almost idly how long until it returns. And in the hush that follows, you can hear, faint as a bell, down another wing, scholars clearing a table for the perennial questions, the 5 debates that keep the house exact, the careful disagreements by which an old story continues to breathe. In the lamp's low circle, scholars clear a table and lay upon it 5 questions that have kept the house exact for centuries, not to conquer one another, but to keep the hinges oiled. And if their voices sound like courtyard rain, it is because tended disagreement nourishes what it touches. First origins. Does he stride in as the sky's necessary counterweight, a dusk principle answering thunder and sea? Or does he rise from older soils, a composite of local chthonic habits, farmers and miners already knew by other names? Philologists, gardeners of roots, point to Ides, the unseen, and to Aidoneus, veiling as an ethic. Historians of cult lift the cornucopia and murmur that Plouton, wealth giver, blossomed later, once cities learned to call return prosperity. Archaeologists add a patient shrug. Here the ground speaks his grammar before his name arrives. There the name walks in without a local accent. The house tolerates both the way a mountain accepts two paths. What matters is that travellers descend with courtesy. Second, the meadows hinge. Was the daughter taken, or did she consent to a treaty older than tribunals, an apprenticeship by which surface learns depth and depth promises to send surface home? The mother's hymn leans toward abduction, grief shaped into season. Orphic whispers soften it into initiation. Civic calendars divide the year in dialect. 1 seed, 4, 6, each an attempt to hold time without bruising it. Feminist pens, warm and exact, ask whether choice survived the tale's passage through patriarchal rooms. Others answer that sovereignty can be learned even in a place not chosen. The temper below is patient here. It keeps the door's two duties, welcome and refusal, while the debate practices the slower art of naming harm and the powers salvaged within it. Third, Eleusis. What did the initiates see when torches walked like careful teachers and barley stood in moon-disciplined rows? An ear lifted, a word made of silence, some small showing that taught the body not to panic at doors? Did the right promise better quarters, or simply better posture in the face of what must be? Some read salvation into the choreography, a passport stamped by the mother's school. Others say the gift was composure, not indulgence. You will go down as all do, but not as a stranger to your breath. Texts stay shy. Vases speak in silhouettes. Thin gold leaves folded for mouths give instructions but not photographs. The question glows like a low fire that cooks without boiling, and in its light households learn what they need: pace, gratitude, the annual permission to mourn without drowning. Fourth, the afterlife's weather, is Homer's shade country, the grey economy where even heroes tire, superseded by later maps that widen Elysium, sharpen penalties, and, in Orphic and Platonic rooms, whisper of ladders, cycles, purifications. Some say continuity holds, one house, many rooms, its ethic constant, proportion, repair, return. Others argue for evolution, a moralization tracking with court's ambitions and philosophies that prefer clarity to fog. The steward below is unruffled. Mortals may redraw the floor plan so long as the load-bearing beams, oath, name, threshold, hold. Fifth, the helm and the horn, bedrock or later polish. The cap that erases footfall wanders through errands shared with Athena and Hermes, a device as ethical as magical, restraint made wearable. The horn of plenty swells in Hellenistic and Roman hands until marble must imitate fruit. Purists wince, syncretists smile, curators point to coins where key and barley balance civic pride with household truth. The quarrel here is really craft review. How much ornament can a tool carry before it forgets its work? Around these five, other questions pace like thoughtful sentries. Is he judge or chiefly keeper while Minos and colleagues weigh? He prefers stewardship. Judgment is a bench in his house, not his hobby. Do the Furies correct with terror or with surgery? The best readers now say surgery, frightening because precision near pain is frightening. Is the three-headed colleague a monster or a professional with a sacred job? Noses understand thresholds better than epithets. And under all the wrangling lies, the quiet consensus that matters. Endings are conversions, not confiscations. Wealth is what returns, not what shouts. Law is a plumb line held still until the wall admits its lean. The debates do not close, they season. In libraries, Rain taps panes like a metronome, while someone bends over a lexicon and a lamp practices the exact circle of light it should keep. In kitchens, a grandmother halves a pomegranate and decides, privately, how many seeds this winter needs. In a courtroom, a pause is allowed to cool a sentence before it hardens. The house below receives the service of all these disciplines the way a harbour accepts boats of different drafts, and somewhere in its corridor a bell gives one polite note to mark that thinking too is a right. Outside evening gathers its deep blue, and on the far side of the table a clean sheet waits, kept for the next duty of care, to straighten popular misunderstandings that keep tripping feet on thresholds, to unlearn the noise where steadiness would suffice. And in that readiness a door seems to breathe, as if agreeing that gentleness, correctly measured, is also a kind of strength, while the lamp, patient as ever, keeps its small weather steady over ink that has not yet chosen its first word. Misunderstandings gather at his threshold the way burrs cling to a traveller's hem, picked up in haste, worn without thought, and perhaps the kindest service to any door is to brush them off before stepping in. First, that he is cruelty in a crown, a tyrant of shadows who delights in confiscation, but cruelty craves an audience, and he avoids audiences whenever possible. His ethic is custody, not spectacle, keeping what must be kept, returning what has ripened, refusing to let endings vandalize what they inherit. Second, the helm as prank, invisibility as license. In truth, its grammar is restraint, the discipline of doing necessary work without hauling attention toward oneself. Surgeons, night shift nurses, and librarians of fragile archives know that virtue by other names. Third, wealth. Because Plouton is wealth giver, some imagine vaults and glitter, yet his horn feeds, it does not flaunt. Here, wealth means returns, grain waking after winter, ore paste to the veins' endurance, trust appearing where careful law has been kept. Fourth, the queen as nothing but captive, erasing the sober growth by which she learns two accents and a sovereignty, able to walk between rooms without tearing. The hymn begins in abduction, grief named honestly, but the covenant that follows is an education in proportion, the portion for depth honoured, the portion for light honoured, a treaty that teaches both kingdoms to keep time. Fifth, Cerberus as mere monster. He is a colleague with a nose for thresholds. His teeth are not for theatre, but for the rare cases that confuse defiance with courage. Sixth, Tartarus as the property's pride piece, bragged like a dungeon. It is quarantine, far and sealed, because heat, that fierce, must never be curated as display. Seventh, the asphodel meadow mocked as dull, forgetting that civilizations stand on middling goodness, debts paid, tools oiled, children taught to speak a name without bruising the air. Eighth, coins for the ferryman sneered at as bribes. They are wages, acknowledgements that labour bears dignity, that every crossing relies on a craft which must be supported if the world is to keep its bridges. Ninth, libations dismissed as theatrics, they are plumbing for feeling, a way to root gratitude through the right soil so thanks will not evaporate into performance. 10th, the mysteries accused of selling immunity. They taught posture, not exemption, how to pass through inevitable doors without panic, how to let grief breathe without swallowing the room. 11th, law maligned as iron for iron's sake, but judges sit where acoustics favour truth, and the Furies, stern aunts of proportion, sow rather than slash. 12th, luck confounded with wealth, decking sudden glitter in the cornucopia's good name. Luck misbehaves, wealth returns. 13th, scholars caricatured as pedants, untying knots no one sees. Their debates, origins, seed numbers, What initiates Saw are the oil that keeps hinges from shrieking, never idle when households must fashion rites that fit the hand. 14th, the underworld, slurred as anti-life, when its patience is exactly what allows daylight to trust itself. Doors above open because doors below remember how to close without hate. 15th, that he despises joy. In the garden, under artificial stars, barley stands beside laurel, and his ledgers savour reconciliations more than any hoard. 16th, that only kings are noticed. The office of names would smile if it permitted itself. Shoemakers, midwives, stubbornly kind aunts, the boy who returned a lost ring, all stand as tall as emperors when measured by kept promises. 17th, punishment as pastime. Repair is nearer the truth. Consequence fitted like a joiner's dovetail so the lesson holds without glue. 18th, the helm feared as self-erasure. Used properly, it is humility's garment, chosen by those who prefer the work, right to being seen at it. 19th, the queen seeds treated as trap. They are arithmetic, calendar made flesh, so that seasons cannot be stolen by tantrum or wish. 20th, myth mistaken for marble, fixed cold when it is housekeeping, practices that teach hands to move gently through rooms where beginnings and endings share a table. Brush these burrs away, and the threshold stops frightening. What remains is a workshop lit by patient lamps, a steward who prefers straightness to thunder, a queen whose footsteps give corridors a second grammar, colleagues who are functions granted affection. Then the upper world tidies too. Panic bars that yield to one push, hospice doors that whisper closed, gardens that let winter be more than loss. Misunderstanding, like mould, loves unwashed corners. Understanding is a wet cloth, a window open 2 fingers' width, a name said once, properly. When the cloth is wrung and the window settled, the cooled air carries the harbour breath of the old house, a single bell finding its note, a key resting in its saucer as if it had chosen trust, and down the lane a torch rehearsing how to be carried without spill, as though something important were about to be set right in a soft, exact light. In the bright rooms, where stories wear grease paint and old gods borrow new faces, he returns like a steady drum beneath changing melodies, now a villain inked too dark, now a statesman in a sober suit, now an employer of thresholds whose office is mistaken for a crypt only because the lamps are set low. Theatre, which adores doors and those who cross them, has courted him since the first chorus learned to keep time. House lights fade, and the stage becomes a cave with a contract signed in hush. Orpheus has been sung so many ways, the hinges might hum along. Lutes tuned to longing in velveted halls, operas where a single forbidden glance anchors 1,000 evenings, new stagings that read the rule not as cruelty but as architecture. Do not turn because faith is a forward muscle. Painters kept vigil too, black figure vessels with hands that pause a breath apart, Renaissance canvases where a queen's face holds 2 seasons at once, neoclassical marbles whose calm asks the living to practice composure. Poets and novelists, eager to watch a spark think, have given him monologues where ledgers sound like prayers. Some imagine the underworld as a bureaucracy that works, others as a small town where names are spelled correctly and bread rises on time. Even children's books, brave in their clarity, sometimes name him the man who keeps promises under the floor while the world sleeps. In cinemas, the myth toggles gloss and mischief. Directors who cannot resist thunder draft him as antagonist because darkness photographs so beautifully. Yet beneath the sheen, a different arithmetic often shows through. A sovereign who resists spectacle, a love story that chooses pacing over possession, a kingdom run on the quiet dignity of return. Musicals follow the beat of boots on boards and discover, in the cadence of descent, how working songs become rites, a train playing the river, a factory the gate, a chorus line, a procession of torchbearers passing fire without spill. In other decades, when romance wears leather and speaks in nightclubs, he becomes the brooding keeper no one understands until the key in his hand is recognised as a philosophy rather than a prop. The Queen, walking between rooms without tearing, reminds audiences that sovereignty isn't volume, it's pace. Comics and picture myths turn emblems into glyphs the eye can memorise. The helm as a sigil for restraint, the cornucopia as a curve that feeds, the pomegranate as a panel of red windows counting months. Somewhere, a reader traces those lines with a fingertip and keeps the lesson without noticing their own keeping. Video games, the laboratories where consequence becomes choreography, borrow his corridors and remember the old economy of return. A player learns that dying is instruction, that repetition is stern kindness, by which skill becomes shape. A father's desk becomes a checkpoint with the patience of an archive. A son discovers progress as a pact with pace. And the music, half lament, half anthem, carries a torch's grammar into headphones. Elsewhere, small independent tales set the myth in 2 a.m. diners, in laundromats, where steam behaves like river fog, in apartment hallways that learn to be safe because neighbours rehearse carrying light downstairs. The story proves portable because thresholds are everywhere and because grief, trimmed to fit a human hand, fits anywhere. Not all retellings are gentle. Some mistake his office for cruelty and the Queen cedes for shackles. Some glamorise harm and call it fate. Some confuse the meadow of middling souls with boredom and forget what holds civilizations up. Yet even misfires throw sparks that light better fires. A reader jarred by a loud version goes hunting the quiet score. A viewer unconvinced by a villain finds the steadier dignity of stewardship and decides complexity nourishes more than swagger. Museums lend the old house a second life by making rooms behave. Glass cases become thresholds, labels speak once and properly, and school children pass in single file as if in a rite. In galleries where gold glints, thin leaves that once rested on tongues whisper instructions to anyone willing to lean close enough to be taught by smallness. On the radio, voices like well-oiled hinges tell the myth as a recipe for not panicking. In podcasts, scholars with warm humour explain how black libation is plumbing for gratitude and how the Furies are seamstresses frightening only because precision near pain is frightening. Even advertising, shameless apprentice of symbols, steals a torch here, a key there, a horn of plenty curving into a cornflake, proving that emblems with honest roots can feed even when their uniforms change. And then there is the folk theatre of daily life, where pop culture is most faithful, nurses dimming lights with a stagehand's mercy, ushers shepherding crowds with Hermes' cadence, stage managers who know doors must open on the right beat or swagger will enter. Funerals borrow microphones and become choruses. Weddings borrow thresholds and become rehearsals for return. Vigils put phones away and teach attention to walk like a procession. Across it all, a single choreography repeats: descent, learning, return, and what audiences keep, though few would call it doctrine, is a felt truth. The dark is not an enemy so much as a studio where bright things are patiently tested. Love improves when given a schedule. Law sounds best. Like a plumb line, not a shout. The old house smiles. If a house can smile, to see itself translated into foam and vinyl, into pixels and strings, and the hush just before the curtain lifts. It asks for very little in return. Wash the door, keep the key, speak the name once, properly. And as the credits roll and the lobby fills with the soft shuffle of coats, someone, perhaps you, feels a coin warm in the pocket, glimpses a pomegranate split into careful stars in a shop window, hears a bell give one patient note down the street. Signs that the story has followed you into the weather and is already, without ceremony, beginning to teach its quiet lessons for today. The night he chose to finish the long keeping of this story was one of those tender evenings when windows seemed to breathe and roofs remembered rain. He set the coin upright in its dish so it held a little moonlight without a tremor, touched the laurel by the door, a small chlorophyll prayer, and let the house learn his unhurried pace. In the lane, a dog practiced the profession of thresholds by attending to nothing in particular. Far off, a torch moved with the calmer motion he had trusted for years, pausing the world's sentence so feeling could arrive intact. He thought of all that had gathered here, the potter's lamp-pale Lethe with Hermes, a respectful step behind, the stone-cutter's relief, where hands stop a breath apart, the old women who know which oil answers, which rash, the baker shaping small ladders for visiting feet, the lamella thin as saved sunlight, teaching a traveller to ask for the cool spring of remembering. He thought of the 5 rivers. There was also 5 rooms in the heart. Acheron, fog, where sorrow learns to be legible. Cocytus, where grief is permitted a road. Phlegethon, the dry flicker of courage that refuses to shout. Lethe, the soft cloth that wipes a gaze before beginning again. And Styx, the dark signature that makes a promise hold. He thought of the helm on its peg, waiting like a lesson, not a prank or vanishing act, but a garment for those who prefer repair to performance, and of the key whose teeth he could trace blind, each notch a quiet ethic. Somewhere in the upper rooms of the world, the mother who knows the syllabus of seasons was folding a shawl for mourning. Somewhere the queen, with seeds sleeping like punctuation in her blood, was rehearsing the 2 accents that let a crown belong to more than one room. Somewhere the fields, practical as stables, devout as kitchens, waited for permission either to green or to rest, both honourable. His house did not boast, but it kept memory the way good wood holds a modest shine. On one shelf slept ledgers that never learned to gloat, accounts reconciled, oaths repaired, debts that chose to end as stories rather than stains. On another, bowls with thick, kind rims waited for hands that had done a day's respectable work. The judge's bench, polished by patience, rested as though every plumb line had been set down to cool. Even Cerberus, citizen of gates, turned his 3 thoughtful heads toward the corridor, where a bell hung, ears trained to the law of a single clear note. He had learned that true endings arrive without parade. They come like housekeeping that lets a room remain itself. So he walked the long gallery of useful things, chisels that tell the truth without shouting, hammers that do not flatter their own weight, a locksmith's files quiet as snow, and laid his palm on each bench as if checking a child's forehead for fever. Mercy had left its small lacuna in punishment's script. Order had allowed a chair to move nearer light. Discipline had remembered the cup on the sill where air might notice it. In the garden beneath artificial stars, the barley sighed with the patience of forms that understand calendars, and the narcissus kept its polish listening without vanity. He paused where laurel learns bravery by proximity, and let memory, which never hurries, pass. Above ground, night rehearsed the courtesy that keeps lamplight square in windows. A nurse drew a curtain without stealing dignity. A judge allowed a pause to cool a sentence. Someone in a city stairwell passed a candle, the way flames prefer to travel, upright, wrist steady, no triumph. A father set the spare key on its saucer so it would not chatter. A child, who could not yet spell philosophy, placed a crumb on the threshold because someone had taught her that doors like to be fed when the world is thin. The god whose office is endings did not collect these gestures. He agreed to be their custodian. He stood as always, in the moral weather of rooms where breath needs to proceed, keeping the pace at which fear forgets to swagger and grief remembers its craft. To call him Hades honours the unseen. To call him Aidoneus blesses the veil humility wears. To call him Plouton admits that wealth, rightly named, is the return of what has vanished. Grain, courage, fairness, a name finding its seat again after wandering. He thought again of Orpheus and the hinge that kept even love steady, of Heracles and the loan that came home, of the boys who learned certain chairs are for thinking, of the household myths, mint for breath, poplar for crossing, pomegranate for keeping a calendar in the mouth. He thought of Eleusis, where torches walk like careful teachers, and one ear of grain is enough to save a winter from despair. Of the Furies, seamstresses of proportion, of Hermes, speaking in the exact diction of thresholds, of Hypnos, teaching bodies the democracy of rest. He thought of you, yes you, breathing where you are, in a room you have taught to be kind, perhaps with a cup of water on the sill, and a small list of names in your pocket, perhaps with a key placed where the mind can unclench. And because stories are also housekeeping, he returned the last objects to their right places, the helm on its peg, to remind noise it is not always invited, the sceptre leaning as good rulers lean, slightly toward work, the ledgers squared by a thumb's width, as if to admit that math too can be tender. He washed the threshold, not for magic, for manners, and listened. When the bell gave its single note, the corridors answered like a harbour at night. Not silence and not song, but the fellowship of kept things. Up above, a mother loosened her cloak by a finger's width. A field lengthened a blade by the width of an eyelash. The sea, which has its own Eleusis, folded a wave with deliberate peace. He stood at the gate and set his palm to iron. It kept the day's warmth like a confidant. Beyond the bars, the road inclined toward its familiar turns. Behind them, the rooms waited in a composure that is not absence, but promise. And because endings need gratitude the way bread needs salt, he let thanks move through him without speech. Thanks for listeners who kept pace, for households that practiced small courtesies with stubborn grace, for scholars who oiled hinges with good arguments, for artisans whose tools refused to lie, for seasons that consent to share a queen, for dogs who know how to keep a threshold without malice, for children who pour a little oil and say a name once, properly. Thank you for walking under these low lamps, for letting the dark be a workshop rather than a threat, for carrying a torch the way torches deserve to be carried. Now the room may release you to the gentlest dimension of night. Lay the key flat so it will not chatter. Fold your shawl in the shape of care. Speak the name you must, once properly. Then let the window keep its soft square of quieter sky, and let sleep, colleague of just governance, take your hand, take your... The story closes like a book returned to its shelf, not shut, but kept, and somewhere, in that patient neighbourhood where bells never hurry, one note continues, soft as breath, while a torch far down the lane lifts and steadies, asking nothing more than to be trusted until morning.